Hello, and welcome back to Everything is Ideology, a cultural studies podcast. I'm Dr. Lee Kaplan. Today we are joined by Dr. Jamil Khader, a Palestinian-American scholar of English literature, literary theory, and cultural politics, whose work brings Marxist critique, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and anti-colonial thought into direct confrontation with the structures that shape global inequality. Our conversation centers on his recent article, Universalizing Capital, Foreclosing Necro-Imperialism, and Žižek's liberal Zionist response to the Gaza genocide, published in the Middle East Critique. In it, Khader offers a rigorous, imminent critique of Žižek's writing on the Gaza genocide. Khader tracks how Žižek repeatedly shifts the explanatory ground away from settler colonialism and necro-imperialism, imperial political economy, and towards moral equivalence, tragic framing, and the language of liberal Zionism. We talk through Žižek's three strategies of foreclosure that Khader calls the mythic, geographical, and ethical, and how these moves can render Palestinian political subjectivity unintelligible even inside theories that claim emancipation as their horizon. Along the way, we get into the larger stakes, Western Marxism and its limits, the problem of universality, and the role of organization and practice, and why thinking from Palestine isn't a narrowing of history, but an insistence that universality must be rebuilt from the standpoint that those made disposable under empire. If you like what we do here, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, I am incredibly honored to be joined by someone whose biography would probably take up the space of the 2 hours that we might be allotted conversation, or the hour and a half, depending on sort of where things go. So it is my absolute honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Jamil Khader, and he is a Palestinian-American scholar of English literature, literary theory, and cultural politics, whose work explores how stories shape our understanding of power, identity, and justice. We will certainly be touching on all these various themes throughout the conversation in a recently published article. But across a career spanning institutions in the Middle East and the United States, he has cultivated a distinctive intellectual voice, bringing together Marxist critique, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and anti-colonial thought to interrogate the entanglements of power, culture, and global inequality. He earned his Ph.D. in English English literature from the Pennsylvania State University, and served as Dean of Research at Bethlehem University in Palestine, and as editor-in-chief of the Bethlehem University Journal. He currently serves as Associate Professor of English at Bethune-Cookman University and HBCU in Florida. Dr. Khader is the author of 2 books and numerous academic and public-facing essays. Thank you so much for being here. I know you have such a large oeuvre of work that you've done. It was hard pinpointing one particular thing, but considering the international imperialist crisis that we're all seeing unfold and it's kind of all of its ugly tentacles, this seemed particularly apt to discuss. And so we're going to be discussing your piece, Universalizing Capital, Foreclosing Necro-Imperialism, Žižek's liberal Zionist response to the Gaza genocide. So first, can you tell us a little bit about why you chose this project, your kind of involvement with Žižek studies writ large, your relationship to that sort of stuff? Thank you.
Lee, thank you so much for having me, and I thank you for the introduction. Very generous. I'm honored to be here as well. So this article is not a new intervention in Žižekian studies that I have made in over the years. I have been engaging Žižek's work for a long time, and I found his work very important, and for my own personal formation throughout the years, it helped me formulate or reformulate important questions that I struggled with in my field of studies. I did my PhD at Penn State on women writers from the Global South, what was usually called post-colonial women writers. But I was always interested in the question of internationalism and internationalist politics and the issue of solidarity between subjects who are under what you call, or I call in the book, actually existing colonialism today in this era, anachronistic sides of colonial domination at this day and age. And I was unable to reconcile some of the contradictions I have encountered in my studies, in postcolonial studies in particular. Postcolonial studies have drifted from the anti-colonial tradition and legacy that I was familiar with into the work of mostly a postcolonial theorists influenced by post-structuralism and the different, premises of postmodern discourse. So when I started reading Žižek, it was really giving me a new vision for looking at revisiting these contradictions in a new way. It gave me a new language to speak about them, which I appreciated a lot. And that's why, my critique is never a personal critique. It's always a professional one. And I have done that in the past through his work. In my book, I co-edited a book with Molly Rothenberg called Žižek Now. And my contribution to the book was an introduction, a general introduction around Žižek's work in general. And then I contributed a chapter that I call Žižek's Infidelity to Lenin's approach to the colonial question, and what I thought was the anti-colonial centrality of the anti-colonial struggle in Lenin's understanding of proletarian struggle and revolutionary consciousness. So that was really significant for me. That was one of my major interventions in his work. And then in 2016, I wrote a short piece about an article he wrote on an Israeli movie called Junction 48, which I also grappled with his understanding of the class struggle and the contradictions within the totality of, Necro-Imperialist domination in Palestine. And I and when he had his article on the refugees and he was attacked by many, leftists, I also intervened in that debate and I published a piece in these times, kind of not defending necessarily, but clarifying the stakes in that debate and shedding some light on how the language he uses is not necessarily commonsensical or should be understood in a certain light that could have explained a little bit more what he was doing. But at the same time, I also critiqued him. So my friends usually, when they approach me about writing about him, they always tell me, we like how you are fair and with regards to his work, that you are very critical, but you're not dismissive. And I try to be not to be dismissive. He has contributed a lot to many different fields, and personally speaking, he contributed a lot to my own growth as an academic. But again, there's a space of debate and controversy, and if you know him well, you'll know that he can handle criticism. This article came out from my struggles with the way that he was defining his position on the Gaza genocide after, October 7th, 2023. So after the Al-Aqsa flood, then he published a piece in Project Syndicate, which reiterated a lot of these major Zionist Hasbara talking points, and it baffled me. Like I'm committed to that emancipatory legacy that he taught me. So I'm just asking myself, where is that emancipatory discourse that we talk about? This is really what I'm committed to. So I struggled with it, and I followed his readings or his articles on or interventions on the Gaza genocide, from the first one, and then through December, I published a short piece in Al Jazeera in December 2023, where I take on some of the issues he talked about in those previous months, so October, November, December. I tried to analyze his position on it, but it was confusing. I was trying to make sense of it in what I called imminent critique. So I was trying to critique his work in relation to his previous statements and writings on the Palestinian struggle for liberation. And I was completely baffled, and I had many questions that I really wanted to answer. So I continued the work on a couple of conference presentations. I was invited to speak, and I extended or elaborated on my Al Jazeera piece, and I tried to make, sense of his work. But honestly, like to the confusion of my audience and to my own bewilderment, I wasn't able to really make coherent sense of his argument. So it bothered me, and I didn't let it go, and I continued working on it. And that's what ended up being my article that was published in Middle East Critique recently. By the way, today I received an email from them. They had included the piece in a special issue on Palestine and Middle East Critique, and my article was organized and featured as the first article in these special issues. So I'm very glad about that.
Yeah, congratulations. I mean, it's not
Thank
just
you.
well-deserved, but a necessary intervention into this type of thing as well. Considering as a lot of people on the left and different academics kind of struggle and think through what it means, what Western Marxism sort of might mean and might look like, and how it has found itself maybe in something that's called the critical and cultural studies industry, which is something that you end your piece kind of talking about, which we will certainly get into what this
Sure.
means for our own analyses and ideologies and understandings and modalities of operation and what resistance could be and look like. I also engaged before our discussion in your piece on Lenin and Žižek and this problem that he consistently has with denying agency and status to potential what could be potential revolutionary subjects or just really human beings in the global south. And it seems to be a real issue that he continually contends with. And I find sometimes Žižek's writing a bit sort of lacking in different ways. Like when he was commenting on even like the pandemic, like that little sort of pamphlet he put out, I was just kind of, I remember having critiques of it at the time. It felt a little like liberalistic and individual and sort of even like contradictorily utopian in different ways. And there's this constant contradiction that I was confused with too, which is if you are sort of writing from a more liberatory framework where that's one of your aims and you're continually referred to as like the most dangerous philosopher in the West, why is he upholding the West so often? And why does he flip-flop so much? I didn't quite understand it. And the reader knows that you've been deeply engaged and respect Zizek's work because you cite things from like such a long, well before this current moment and conjuncture of the Gaza and Palestinian genocide. So I don't know. I was just wondering if you could maybe extemporize a little bit on just why, why the flip flopping. Um, and I don't want to engage in bad faith and just be like, it's the particular outlets, that he gets paid more for doing X, Y, and Z. I do not want to engage in that sort of bad faith thing. But what do you think?
Yeah, it's great comments and a very good question. And, I struggled with it as well. But I think that, part of the answer for me lies in this critique that I developed in 2013 in relation to, as you said, Zizek's position on anti-colonial resistance and anti-colonial struggles, national liberation movements, and his ambiguous position on Lenin and this whole critique that Losurdo developed recently regarding Western Marxists. I think that in my 2013 article, a chapter in the book, I basically I talk about his soft Marxism. So there's he invokes capitalism, and he offers an anti-capitalist critique, which is central to his work. But the way that he presents it, especially in the context of Palestine, if you read his earlier work from the early 2000s, it is it's invoked in order to frame his discussion of anti-Semitism. His discussion of anti-Semitism is central to the way that he perceives capitalism and the position of the Jew in capitalist culture. And I agree with all of that. But the thing is, as I say in one of my the sections in the article, is that he tends to use this anti-Semitism framework in order to obscure or replace the real antagonism in the Palestinian struggle for liberation, the struggle of the Jewish people in Europe and other parts of the world against anti-Semitism intersects with the Palestinian struggle for liberation, for sure. And we have seen a lot of Palestinian Jewish solidarity. But the problem is that he refuses to analyze the Gaza genocide or the Palestinian struggle in general through the material structures of settler colonialism and necro-imperial political economy. So for him, thinking about it primarily through anti-Semitism and Jewish moral trauma does not really offer him um, the a productive answer. It doesn't really take him anyway. And so I think in many ways it's a conceptual problem that he's really committed to a particular um, vision of politics and the world, especially when it comes to the Jewish question. But when he applies it to the Palestinian struggle wholesale, he's not willing to confront the contradictions there. Some people were telling me, "Oh, we don't know." I mean, I'm repeating here, but obviously this is not my position, and I'll tell you what I said. They were like, "Oh, probably it's the Epstein files." I said, "Well, I looked at the Epstein files. He's not there. Actually, Chomsky is there, but he's not there. His name comes up because someone recommended to Jeffrey Epstein, someone recommended um, Žižek's lecture that he was presenting in New York sometime. But I mean, it's not an issue of compromise, or I think he's really committed to the argument about anti-Semitism. It's at the center of his work. And in one version of my essay, of my article, I struggled with this libidinal investment. At one moment, I wanted to think about the Zizek's libidinal investment in this question and why he keeps repeating these particular arguments. But I thought, well, what evidence do I have for libidinal investment here? I cannot just simply conclude something abstract. I don't have him on my couch. I'm not a psychoanalyst. I'm not reading anything. I'm not really interested in that. What I'm interested in is what he offers me analytically and conceptually. And what he offers analytically and conceptually um, does not present a convincing answer. He simply transforms a structural colonial project into a tragic moral dilemma. He just simply wants to see it as a tragic situation. He turns genocide into ethical ambiguity. And as you said, it makes Palestinian political subjectivity really difficult to think within his framework. So for me, what I ended up basically thinking about the evidence, and that's why the article really is an extensive textual analysis and eminent critique of his position. So what all of my thinking about his work led me to was the displacement and the foreclosure of necro-imperialism or necro-imperial settler colonialism at the center of this project. So he does not really pay attention to it. Gaza for him is some sort of a humanitarian crisis. It's not. It is a laboratory of necropolitical management and extractive capitalism within this necro-imperial world order. Let me just, I mean, just to make clear that our viewers and listeners understand, my argument is not that Zizek supports genocide, and I never say that. Actually, he was critical, and he made his critique of Netanyahu and the extreme right in Israel very clear. He actually registers the horror of the genocide. He names the excess. He condemns the violence, and he even uses terms like settler colonialism once in his interventions. But he repeatedly shifts the explanatory ground away from such settler colonial structures and toward the problem of anti-Semitism, moral equivalence, and tragic contradiction. That is really a big problem in his theoretical framework that in the end cannot sustain a consistent analysis of the structure. That's why I also talked about his soft Marxism and his undialectical materialist approach, which collapses into liberal Zionist moral framing when confronted with the Palestinian question. So I try to track and trace how he presents this argument, how he disavow it, and the different ways through which this foreclosure operates. And again, the stakes are not personal, they are theoretical and political. So if we misidentify the principal antagonism, if we treat anti-Semitism as the master contradiction, rather than settler colonial necro-capitalism, then Palestinian liberation becomes unintelligible with his own Hegelian universality, which is a topic that I refer to in the article and that I'm committed to. Like in the manuscript I'm working on Palestine, I really was trying to articulate this universal singularity of the Palestinian condition, drawing on his work. So his work still, I'm not dismissing it altogether. I wanted to correct the political and theoretical implications of his intervention. In a way, if you want to, I can say that my intervention is really constructive. Like I argue that Palestinians today are not merely what he calls concrete universal, but they are the universal singular. And he puts that in a footnote, but I put it at the center of my work because I think it's an important idea and it's worth retrieving.
No, that makes perfect sense. And I found your engagement with him, rather than just dismissive, as you referred to, I don't know if you're recording it, as some of your colleagues referred to, not dismissive, but actually quite generative. And you're thinking with someone to think through what they didn't think of or what they missed because of their style and frameworks of thinking. And so what I was thinking about was actually, you know how like a lot of people talk about dialectical materialism as a sort of inversion of Hegelian thought, insofar as like it makes the materialism principle to the idealism, like the material follows the ideal. I thought you were doing the same sort of thing where you're kind of like flipping it on its head in some sort of way, where you're taking these overly overdetermined ideological and cultural aspects, and then also including and making it more of the principal contradiction, the sort of settler colonial necro, even pedophilic, we could include, regime happening here, right? I've seen it discussed in many ways now, the Epstein regime, Zio-America, all these various
The
things,
Epstein
but all
class,
pointing
yeah,
to the
for
same
sure.
thing. Yeah. And I thought that was a really useful way of what you're doing. And I was just kind of curious, if I could quote you a little bit. You said, Zizek's interventions on Israel's war crimes and genocide in Gaza are a natural extension of his long-standing Lacanian Hegelian engagement. So this is the particular framework that we all know Zizek for, and which is he persistently refers to as the Israel-Palestine conflict, or in the language of liberal Zionism, the situation. So, I was wondering if you could discuss, and you kind of have gotten to this, but the ways in which he invokes Lacanian and Hegelian engagement in this, and how it inevitably sort of recourses and falls back into himself in liberal Zionism. And I was
Right.
wondering also if you could talk about, sorry for the tripartite question perhaps, but also what the issue of liberal Zionism is to make it clear for people. And then, of course, how liberal Zionism makes it impossible for this working class solidarity, et cetera, that he talks about.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to start from the last point, for liberal Zionism, um, is one of those obviously discourses of Zionist ideology that is grounded in socialist labor ideology. But the problem with it is that, some people think that liberal Zionism has this emancipatory kind of potential, but at the same time, it preserves and maintains this fantasy of Israel's pre-1967 Jewish and democratic core. So despite all of these, the occupation, the genocide, the ongoing Nakba that is happening since 48, does not really for them mar or stain the the democratic core of the Israeli state. So what they do is that for them, whatever excesses that the Israelis have committed are basically forgiven because the identity of Israel is grounded in trauma and security, but they detach it from any notion of colonial violence that made it possible. So it's true that they reject like Likud style revisionism and its excesses, annexation, expansion, militarism, but not the settler colonial structure itself. And this is really the problem for me, that they don't see their colonization practices as Arij Sabah Khoury said in her recent book, and I quote her in the article. They do not see their colonization practices as being at odds with their commitment to collectivist cooperation and class liberation. This is really what's baffling about it. And it's an issue that I also engaged with in a recent article I finished, and it's coming out in two different versions on the Palestinian novelist work Adaniya Shibli, A Minor Detail. I don't know if you read this book, but I would really recommend it
Yeah,
for you and
phenomenal
the
book.
audience. Yeah,
Relatively short
Minor
too.
Detail in Arabic Tafsil Thanawi. Really great book. And it engages this false Zionist universality, universal humanism, that where they talk about, the triumph of the human, but at the same time deny all of that colonial violence that the Zionist settler colonial project is embedded in order to fulfill its historical role within this larger necro-imperial formation that I describe in the article. When it comes to Hegel and Lacan, his analysis um, of the Gaza genocide and the Palestinian struggle in general, as I say in the article, is Lacanian in the way that it pushes him into this false equivalence and the tragic consequences of the genocide and the ongoing Nakba. What he calls, as you said, the matzav in Hebrew, the situation. Um, and when it comes to Hegel, the problem becomes for him is his inability to push the Hegelian dialectic a a step further. So, for example, when it comes to Lacan, and I trace these in the article in the section on his utopian vision. I think it's the third section of the article, where he basically talks about three homologies that define Palestinians and Israelis. The what he calls the tragic. Um, let me he talks about them in terms of the weird similarities
Yes.
between Palestinians and Israelis, if you remember in the article. That's a term that he uses. So when it comes to framing these weird similarities between Israelis and Palestinians, he defines them in terms of these different homologies and the experiences of Palestinians and Israelis. Like both of them were victims, both of them were victims of Western racism. He really does not even raise the question of who victimized the Palestinians. So he creates an equivalence between Palestinians and Israelis without even invoking the clear problem that this analogy is completely false, because the Palestinians are the victims of the Zionist Israelis and Zionist settler colonialism. So he goes and he explains that they have a shared history of expropriation and dispossession. And he calls it later a common experience of racial victimization. So for him, the Holocaust and the Nakba appear as parallel traumas, two symmetrical events in which both peoples are victims of history. Then he implies that in the Israeli national imaginary, Hamas now occupies the same structural position that the Jew once held for European anti-Semites. So it's the external enemy on whom the Israeli self projects its anxiety or divisions, internal divisions. Then he talks about the history of the term terrorism and how it was once applied to the Jewish underground, as you can see recently, for example, from the movie Palestine 1936. So what he does is that he collapses his insight into the same liberal Zionist counter-terrorist lexicon that he purports to destabilize. So it's really incredible that he does that. And obviously, it's not only that he uses Lacan in order to produce something at the level of the imaginary, like this identification between um, Israelis and Palestinians. But for him to do this, he needs to avoid any materialistic reading of the situation. And that's where he obviously, as I say in the article, he inverts Hegelian dialectics. He betrays Hegelian dialectics. Okay, like he says the Palestinians and their Israeli neighbors. And obviously, if you know Lacan's work and Žižek's work on Lacan, you know that the neighbor is used in a particular term in a particular way, but he doesn't mean it that way, which is like the monstrous, unknown monstrous side of your neighbor that you don't know. Like you don't know whether your neighbor is a hideous serial killer, right? He's not talking about that. He's just talking about the neighbor in commonsensical way. So he basically wants to acknowledge the deadlock or the antagonism in which both sides are caught. But to frame that, he uses none other than David Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion, he cites him saying, there is an unbridgeable abyss between Zionist and Palestinian aspirations. And he talks about that in his essay, Whether Zionism. And he cites him approvingly, that there is no solution, and I'm quoting here from the article, here's an abyss and nothing can link its two sides. We as a people want this land to be ours. The Arabs as a people want this land to be theirs. But as I say in the article, Ben-Gurion was not neutrally diagnosing an impasse, right? It's an ideological strategy. How come Žižek, the master of ideological critique, cannot see that what Ben-Gurion is doing is an pure ideological maneuvering? Because it conceals the colonial asymmetry between a movement, right, armed and financed by imperial powers, and an indigenous population resisting dispossession. So Ben-Gurion's ideological commitments were deeply shaped by this belief in Jewish emancipation through population transfer and territorial sovereignty, which he completely ignores. I mean, I would recommend people reading Segev's book on Ben-Gurion to see exactly what he believed in. He never believed in this tragic, soft Lacanian imaginary kind of talk, He recast political choices like expulsion, partition, militarized sovereignty. Ben-Gurion was really seeking to transform domination into some sort of destiny, right? While disavowing agency at the same time. So for me, Zizek's appropriation of this logic was completely undialectical, right? It's like a pseudo parallax where the non-coincidence between the Palestinian and Israeli perspective becomes the truth of the situation. But that's not the truth of the situation. The truth of the situation is the Zionist false universality that they want the land, we want the land, or whatever, over the historical asymmetry of power that exists in this whole situation. So this is a major problem in the way that he inverts Hegel. And then the other step that I describe in the article, I think at least a couple of times, is his inability to conceive of the Palestinian as a determinate negation of Zionism, right? If you cannot see the Palestinians as a determinate negation of Zionism, then you are not going to be able to resolve or create a new contradiction in this Hegelian dialectical movement of Zionism and anti-Semitism, or anti-Semitism, Zionism, Zionist anti-Semitism, and what comes next? This is the step that he doesn't really acknowledge, because he refuses to look at the Palestinian, as you said, the Palestinian agency, as the constitutive exclusion of Zionism and its negated term. So because he doesn't do this, he cannot really account for the Palestinian. Instead of confronting the contradiction between Zionism and anti-Semitism in the figure of the Palestinian, he simply privileges anti-Semitism as the main problem, and therefore he forecloses any colonial reading of Palestine and neutralizes its revolutionary potential. I don't know. I hope I clarified this position, but it works on both ways, where he comes lacking in his theoretical and conceptual framework.
Yeah, no, that was great. That was really, really helpful and clarificatory. The instance with sort of invoking the Ben Gurion sort of discourse that also like Netanyahu and others have promulgated is this abyss sort of naturalizes apartheid in the same way that Jim Crow was naturalized within Americas, and sort of it naturalizes this particular colonial mapping where it's like you're here, you're here. It naturalizes the fragmentation that has happened as a result of the colonial body, and you get into that sort of thing of reframing the genocide in different geographical regions and whatnot as a means of displacing, and also kind of saying that maybe Zionism can be saved in some way, which we see a lot of people talking about within, like, the problem isn't the kind of person in charge, but the entire sort of place, right? And this framing of it being an ideological thing rather than a structural thing is what you kind of find Hegel to be doing, which is called bad infinity, where it's just this continual negation that doesn't actually sublate in some way. It's a continually regressive discourse that finds no solution, just a continual tragedy, right? And this helps prop up the sort of rhetoric that Žižek is doing, that this is just sort of liberal Zionism doing its thing, and this is the natural way to think about it. So these two ideas of displacing the struggle into the ideological, and both naturalizes a sort of apartheid situation, and also makes it so that it's this inevitable bad infinity regressive situation. And I
No,
thought that was like,
absolutely. Very good. So
yeah.
thank you.
Well, yeah, I thought that was great. So I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit about these. You note three strategies or homologies, in particular, you use that language, of these strategies of foreclosure that Zizek brings up, right? And this is a great sort of discursive analysis that you point to. And
Thank you.
they are the mythic, geographical, and ethical. I know we sort of touched on various themes and whatnot. They all create this messy weave, as discourse does. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about choose one, and we could go maybe in order,
Sure.
whatever you want.
Absolutely. But maybe before we do the disavowal strategies, it's just as a reminder, just to frame the whole strategies within the major argument that I'm making. I'm bringing up this topology, these different disavowal strategies, because it's through them that he cannot repress the settler colonialism, and that settler colonialism returns, the return of the repressed, so to speak. So, as I say in the major argument, is that his approach to the Gaza genocide is for closing the real antagonism, right? The necro-imperialist Zionist settler colonialism. And he says explicitly in his articles and later on that were included in his book of 2025, from 2025, that my general frame or story is not colonization, right? So he clearly rejects the historicity and materiality of necro-imperial Zionist settler colonialism that renders the genocide legible. If I may quote from him, he says, "My general frame or story is not colonization. In my Frankfurt speech, I never use the term, being well aware that Jewish immigration to Israel cannot be reduced to colonialism. This story will not be a single narrative of colonization or of terrorists. Refusal to accept the Jews returning to their homeland, but an authentically tragic story of conflicting claims in which nobody is simply right." Obviously, it repeats some of the things that we mentioned before, but the most important point here is that he simply brackets the foundational act of Zionist settler colonial violence, the 1948 Nakba, and the ongoing manifestations of the Nakba today, and never engages with the refugee questions and ignores the right of return for Palestinians. And again, the ongoing Nakba all over historical Palestine. And again, it's not that he doesn't know this. This is the thing with the return of the repressed, because he tries to repress it, to negate it, it comes back to haunt his writing all the time. I mean, in his writing, as I say, he talks about colonialism. He frames the creation of the Israeli state within the ethnic cleansing of Jews from Europe, right? But he says there that the Europeans, the original sin of the Europeans, is that they tried to make amendments for the Holocaust by giving to Jews a piece of land mostly inhabited for centuries by other people. Okay, so I mentioned, and at the end of this section, and again, he keeps repeating this language. In Welcome to the Desert of the Real, he talks about Zionism as the last chapter in the history of colonization. You know, this is why I struggled in the beginning in my conference interventions before, in making sense of these contradictions. Like, you are saying it's colonialists. Why are you denying it's colonialists? This is really what I don't understand. It's like it's written by different multiple writers, you know, like the story about Shakespeare probably was the name of a collective. Maybe Žižek is the name of a collective. I don't know. Or they're completely inconsistent on a simple, basic thing that he talks about. He says, like, he admits that early Zionists used the term colonialism to describe the colonization of Palestine. In 2021, he wrote, in 1896, Theodor Herzl wrote in Der Judenstaat, the founding text of Zionism, "For Europe, we will build there in Palestine a part of the wall against Asia. We will provide ramparts against barbarism." He connects it directly to colonialism, to civilizational project. So these terms haunt his writings. He keeps coming back. He denies it, but he tries to foreclose it. But then this repression is not successful. Again, I went through all of them, and there are so many symptomatic slips that not only contradict his refusal to name necro-imperialist Zionist settler colonialism as the structure and logic of the Gaza genocide, they also function ideologically, right? They displace this unassimilable reality of colonial violence with narratives that seek to patch over the structural split at the heart of this project. So for me, like when he slips, this is not neither innocent nor inconsequential. Okay, so he repeatedly circles the actual problem, and then he reintegrates it into three different disavowal and mystification strategies. So the first one is the easiest one, which I already mentioned in the quote. He basically, and again, contradicting himself, claims that Zionism is actually um, a project of return. He calls it immigration and return to mythic homelands. So he says, I'm well aware that Jewish immigration to Israel cannot be reduced to colonialism, defining it again as the return of the Jewish people to their homelands. And he oscillates between calling Zionist settler colonialism immigration and emigration. So implying arrival on the one hand to a foreign or politically distinct place on the one hand, and the other implying return to an original homeland. And this vacillation, the oscillation persists, even though he acknowledges that the land was already inhabited, as I mentioned before. And again, his lexical choices function always as euphemisms that domesticate and depoliticize Zionist settler colonialism. It's as if he is recoding it as a restoration or a natural or rightful homecoming rather than colonization. And I quote different, historians and critics who ground their understanding of Zionist settler colonialism not simply as immigration or immigrants who seek to join an existing polity, including the Jewish old Yishuv, but that they sought to replace the existing polity, the indigenous population, with their own political sovereignty. So this disavowal strategy allows him again to continue mystifying the principal antagonism in the situation. And again, as I said, my project began as an immanent critique. I'm using Žižek against Žižek. So in one of his articles, if I may quote this, he says, what I maintain is that the mythic past cannot be used as a legitimate excuse to seize a piece of land inhabited for a long time by other people. Of course, every ethnic group has a full right to keep alive its founding myths and other narratives. I'm saying you cannot come to a land out of which you were thrown almost 2,000 years ago, a land which was in the meantime inhabited by other people, and not those who threw you out, that is, ancient Romans, who have their own myths and narratives concerning this land and lay claim to it. This doesn't mean that Jews have no right to the piece of land, while Palestinians have the full right to it. Right? Again, it took me a while to be able to find a narrative through which I can fit all of these puzzling and contradictory statements from him, where he acknowledges and denies, critiques, and then incorporates. It was really baffling, and I honestly, the question that I raised about how many Zizeks wrote these articles is really a pertinent question for me. Like the contradictions are so stark, it's incredibly scandalous. Like the same sentence contains a claim and its refutation. So before, his earlier demythologization that anchored critique and the asymmetry of land seizure, now he basically reproduces the Zionist fantasies of return and mythic origins. He himself dismissed them as anachronistic and implicitly justifies the anti-Semitic and Zionist logics he claimed to critique. So again, he regrounds the language of political rights in the very grammar of mythic entitlement that he previously repudiated. So again, that was a clear one, and um, a strategy that over identifies him with the Zionist narrative, right? Zionist narrative strategies that rehabilitate mythic temporality of return and therefore contradict the logic of his earlier critique of Zionist mythic legitimations as ideological mystification.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Again, just totally agree with the whole like there's this haphazard collection of different writings. It's like he was trying out different writings and kind of throwing it at the wall and seeing what stuck and all of these various things, you know. And it's not an interview unless a cat shows up. That's how it always
I'm
works,
sorry.
right?
This
No,
is
no, it's
Lily.
fine.
Lily loves intellectual stuff.
Oh, well, I'm a huge fan of Lily as well.
Oh,
And what's
great.
in yeah, what's interesting is you also discuss in terms of this sort of Zionist historiographical sort of lens. I wanted to ask you about these two things, right? So he's discussing the right of return for just some people and not others, right? When there's a very clear historical moment that he then ignores. So it's kind of contradictory, the sort of like picking and choosing he does of various aspects, right? And it echoes what you said that Ilan Pepe identifies as the dominant Zionist historiographical move. And this is the systematic, you write, the systematic rejection of any colonial analogy in favor of a self contained nationalist narrative. And I wanted to ask about this part. You say it serves two functions. Um, which is methodologically, it treats Zionist discourse of the late 19th and early 20th centuries as transparent evidence of its aims, thereby bracketing off the material and structural features of the settlement project. And then you have the second, which is politically, it shields Zionism from the normative discrediting attached to colonialism in contemporary discourse. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and kind of unpack what you're saying here and what you're
Sure.
getting at.
Yeah, I mean, like if you think about what Papi is saying here, I mean, like Zionist historians, obviously what Zizek is doing in this case, for him, the Zionist ideology becomes completely a transparent discourse. Like you basically believe what they are saying about their project. There's, well, like what you see in American politics. Well, he just said that he's not guilty, right? So you have to take it, right? He just said it. So that's the authority that you're appealing to. The same thing here. Like they are basically appealing to this discourse and ideology that we are a nationalist project. We don't have anything to do with colonialism, even though they themselves acknowledge. Weizmann, Herzl, and others have explicitly linked, as I said in the article, Zionism to colonialism. Israel as an imperial proxy started with its own foundation, with the foundation of the Zionist movement. So what by simply taking their word for it, he brackets off these material and structural features of the settler colonial project. Okay, I mean, like you say, it's a settler colonial project. At least do the analysis. Why do people, writers since the 50s and 60s? I mean, this settler colonial thing is not a new thing. It has been written about by anti-colonialist Jews, by Palestinian scholars, by internationalists, um, theorists from the 50s and 60s on. This is not a new discourse. So at least look at those material and structural features of the project itself and engage it that way. But don't take their word for granted. That they say it's not, therefore it's not. And then, politically speaking, like when he does this, he basically protects, right, and shields Zionism from all of these critiques that we see today attached to colonialism and anti-colonial and anti-imperial discourses. And I talk later about his position, his problematic position on decolonization, which is really, really problematic. And now I was thinking about it, at the time that I finished submitting the article and revising it, and I sent it back. Obviously, we were not dealing with the invasion of Iran and Marco Rubio's statement about the invasion. But the whole thing um, with the way that the American policy is describing colonialism here is very problematic, and their critique of decolonization, right? Like he came out. Sorry, it's not about the Iranian invasion. It was about his speech in Berlin, where he said that we have to recenter Western colonialism now. You remember that? And when he talked about, these decolonial movements and anti-colonial movements, basically demonizing them. You know, I wish that this statement came out as clear as it was articulated by Rubio at the time I was completing the essay, so I can footnote it and add it, because that's exactly when Žižek and other people like him who identify with socialist or emancipatory projects demonize decolonial movements, right? If you are demonizing decolonial movements because you are what? I mean, the ultimate conclusion here is that you are supporting the project of U.S. imperial hegemony in the world. I mean, this is coming like the truth from the horse's mouth. It's very clear. So putting these together was really problematic for me, trying to understand exactly how he manages to reconcile these contradictions, why he doesn't really push his critique of Zionism a little bit more. It stops at that sort of notion of um, the transformation of Zionism into anti-Semitic Zionism or Zionist anti-Semitism. And that's what he is really worried about. That's where he stops. That's why the Palestinian is not really included in it. Or at least, as I say in the geographic disavowal, only one part of Palestine is included in it. I don't know
No,
if
that's
that answered your question.
yeah, that was really wonderful. Of course it did. Everything's been really wonderful to learn from. In addition with the geographic disavowal that you just mentioned, there seems to be this reticence of also an epistemological disavowal. So he can never think from the point of view of Palestinian resistance. You could see that in his choice of citational practices and who he quotes and when he quotes and why he quotes. He completely refuses to afford any agency or completely neglects the rich tradition of Palestinian theorization and anti-imperialist thought and scholarship, which is part of one of the many issues as well, because even like there's like this really quick sort of piece on the philosophy salon of like thinking about Hegel in Gaza and the impossibility of that sort of thing, right? And it's right here. He writes for the philosophy salon. So it's relatively surprising that he doesn't engage with that, but maybe it's perhaps unsurprising at the same time.
No, it's not. I mean, one of the pieces that I struggled to include in the article, it was my original, the first section or the first paragraph of my concluding section of the article was an essay he wrote for Substack called Decolonization and Its Impasse, which really epitomized everything that I was saying in the article. But then I decided to change it for another piece that was as horrible and horrendous and served me as a different matter to introduce the distinction between concrete universality and the universal singular. But in that piece, Decolonization and an Impasse, he not only forecloses Gaza, he doesn't utter its name. The Palestinian is reduced to an example of obscenity, and Gaza is disappeared entirely. And as you just said, like, who are the people he quotes? He begins by quoting the heroic Zionist commander, right, who launched an investigation into some soldiers, but he completely also erases the context that this Zionist IGF commander launched the investigation to avoid an inquiry by the ICJ. Okay, and he shifts the scene of the struggle to the West. and to the West Bank, and only focuses on Zionist settler terrorists instead of looking at the whole structure. So the whole economy of death becomes a kind of a moral narrative about Israeli corruption. That's exactly how it turned. Read it. I mean, it's incredible. I wrote it, I analyzed it and everything, and then I decided, because of I had only 10,000 words to use, I had to be selective in what I did. But it was as horrendous as the other section on anti-Semitism. The way that it comes off as a complete disregard for Palestinian humanity. Okay, completely erasing Gaza, sentimentalizing the Israeli military's legal machinery, reducing settler colonialism to moral decay of a few extremists, right? This is not Hegelian, this is not dialectical, this is not materialist, this is not Marxist at all.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, the critique of looking at someone that generally thinks in dialectical terms and then isn't, for whatever reason, et cetera, reminds me of like Louis Althusser's writing on this on Khrushchev's secret speech, and he's like, this secret speech was highly undialectical, and it's like this sort of it's a very solid move to always reground ourselves, even when we're looking at something like now. Why wouldn't we use the historiographical and analytical tools that we so often use in other stuff, right? Just because it's happening now doesn't mean we should think about it in those terms or something, right? And this also precludes thinking about the future situation as well. I'm not sure if Žižek has a future or thinks or can think of a future, right? Because colonialism also forecloses the future as well to create a temporary state of the present. So it's a degradation of, it's a collapsing also. It's a foreclosure of the
Absolutely.
possibility.
Yeah.
Um, and for Zizek and so many other thinkers, the possibility remains maybe one of the most important aspects, um, because it's like, why do any of this work if there isn't the possibility, right? So I always thought that I was thinking about this framing, his temporal framing is also part of an issue as well.
Absolutely.
Because he allows a past and present and future for some groups, but then doesn't even think in terms of humanity for others, let alone imagine a history for others as well. And he, as we just talked about with various aspects of Zionist historiography, he sort of picks and chooses various moments instead of like looking at teleological narratives and arcs and all of these other various moves that you would expect, maybe.
No, I mean, when we get to the third disavowal strategy, the ethical one, and the emphasis on anti-Semitism, I will share exactly why, the obscene and outrageous example for me that really was, that's it. For me, it was the last straw, right? It was really like, that's it. This is really over and beyond. I mean, I could not take that anymore. And we can talk about that later.
No, no, we could move into that now. So I assume you're talking about something like the Hill of Corpses.
Correct. Exactly.
Okay, there were two parts of this that really stuck out to me as just like ouch moments or something. Like they were
Hmm.
very guttural. And that was to me this Hill of Corpses, not huge issue.
Yeah.
Um, and just reducing, people to nothingness, et cetera, which we'll get into and talk about. And then the other thing, when you talk about his Substack, a later piece, and he just says he's bored of
Yeah.
hearing about
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and that's insane to me.
Yeah.
Um, so it's
Yeah,
almost
I
like,
included that. Yeah, yeah. I talked about that. Yeah.
so I was wondering if you could talk about the Hill of Corpses, how he invokes this story, sort of what it means. And obviously, there's a lot of different Palestinian intellectuals that think about how the body operates as as a site of terror, as a site of, sort of possibility. And also, even after death, there's another death that occurs, and perhaps even a third, whether it's like bulldozing sort of cemeteries or like
Yeah.
not knowing who's there, or just further dehumanization of corpses, or like sort of taking bits and body parts of organs and then using them for other purposes, like so I was wondering if you would tell us about this
Yeah.
hill of
I
corpses.
mean, I mean, to be honest with you, this was, as I said, like so outrageous for me and so painful to read. Like I really, um, like for me again, that was like a turning moment and point in my attempt to sort of situate this into a critical framework that can shed the light on what he's doing. So, and in this section, if you remember, I tried to talk a little bit about how he frames anti-Semitism and how he looks at, you know, the figure of the Jew in anti-Semitic ideology, which was all good. And I agree with that analysis. Um, but then he begins projecting that on Palestine, and then instead of sort of framing the genocide, right, and the way that it's instrumentalized as a symptomatic residue of another people's catastrophe, the Holocaust, he begins by basically asking the question, like what he says, in other words, what does this mean for Jewish identity? Like everything that he says about Palestine is not really about Palestine. It's in relation to the two questions: what does a Jew want, and what does this mean for Jewish identity? And so he begins by turning the Gaza genocide into a provocation, like a cause of anti-Semitic backlash rather than a manifestation of colonial violence. And then he begins obfuscating Palestinian death and catastrophe by recentering what he calls the conflict within this field of anti-Semitism. So one of the things that I insist on saying, and that he basically conveniently obscures the fact that Palestinians resist Zionist settlers not as Jews, but as Zionist colonizers who happen to identify as Jews. And he even contends that the Al-Aqsa flood attacks were designed to stoke anti-Semitism. Imagine someone saying this. It's just like he critiques conspiracy theories, and then this sounds really like a conspiracy theory that Hamas provoked this in order to give birth to a new wave of anti-Semitism? For real? Um, and then, you know, you read a title, one of his titles called Canceling Palestine, and you're like, oh, wow, okay, let's see what that's all about. So, is he going to really talk about canceling Palestine? He doesn't talk about canceling Palestine. It goes back to the fact that the danger that he sees, he says, if Germans or Europeans or people around the world get dissatisfied with European policy, it will take the form of anti-Semitism. Over and over, again and again, he goes back to valorize anti-Semitism over the lived realities of Palestinians under a genocidal regime that has claimed so thousands of lives every in the last over the last 2 years and over the last 79 years. Then he talks about it comes to this again, the story that he quotes by Chesterton, the classic Father Brown story, The Son of the Broken Sword, where he ruminates about how crimes are committed to conceal other crimes. So Father Brown uncovers that a British general staged a reckless assault, building a hill of corpses to conceal his own crime. So Žižek uses this, retools it as a metaphor to suggest that Israel is building a hill of Palestinian corpses, and then he says, for what? Right? He says, for what? And then he goes, here comes the surprise. And what is the surprise? That the hill of Palestinian corpses is meant to cover the corpse of Jewish identity. I was like, what is this perverse, shockingly perverse ideological mystification? For God's sake. Are you really listening? Are you reading what you are writing? So all of these Palestinian dead people, 20,000 children, to hide the corpse of Jewish identity? Palestinian corpses become allegories of the colonizers' moral decay and spiritual loss. It's genocide is not a crime, but a tragic loss of ethical selfhood. So he centers the moral stake of Zionist violence around Jewish identity rather than the structural conditions or lived experiences of the Palestinian victims. As you said before, like total disregard for Palestinian life and death and dignity in death. So we are meant to serve simply as a screen behind which he retrieves a unified symbolic ideal, which for him is Judaism as an unbroken tradition of redemptive universalist ethics. So we are the remainder that must be discarded so this narrative can stand. So we are, again, like to use his Lacanian lexicon, we are the objet petit a, the traumatic excess that threatens his fantasy of ethical universality, only to be repressed so this fantasy of unbroken Jewish tradition can stand. Again, like for me, when I was reading and analyzing this, I was shocked. I mean, it was for me like the honestly, um, a rhetorical move that I never expected. And I don't know if he has ruminated on this and thought about it again and what it really means, but that's exactly what it means. It's a Eurocentric, smacks of racism, of, of the death of thousands and thousands of brown people in Palestine. It's really unforgivable. And that's what really got me in this piece. Like it was really emotional for me. Thinking like as I said when I was intervening and on a panel at the SALA conference in Montreal, people talking about his work, and I said, what appealed to me in the first place about his work was the fact that, as he was saying, when he spoke the language of the theorists of Lacan and Hegel, Western Europeans did not like it. Like, who are you to speak our own language? And I thought, because he identifies as a man from the Balkan, that he is a Southern in terms of his subject position vis-a-vis Western Europeans, that he completely identifies with the global South and the struggles of the global South, the colonized and people in national liberation. But when it comes to, and I'm sure that he had expressed some genuine feelings about it in different sort of contexts, but when he simply uses the Palestinians as a metaphor for Jewish identity, that is completely unacceptable. That's where, the truth of his racist discourse comes out. And it is outrageous and was totally unexpected. But again, when I started looking back and putting the whole text together and the way that he is struggling formulating a coherent argument about Zionist colonialism and the Palestinian position, it just made sense. I mean, this is really where he stands.
Yeah, this part was completely atrocious. And it's something like if it was up front or further into the introduction of the article, it would have been kind of like a heavier thing and a harder thing to sort of get through as well. So it's in there towards the end, and it seems like, it's the most important part to deal with, but the most atrocious, and you kind of have to build up to that argument. And, perhaps his argument is a hill of corpses as well, this particular thing. So it was definitely shocking and quite abysmal. And also very much in line with sort of like settler colonial ideology and sort of the way
Absolutely.
it maps various projections onto the body. And now it's not about like an interiority that could possibly exist in what's called the other, the colonial other. It's they exist for our own sort of benefit, whether it's a spiritual benefit or a redemption benefit or a redemption arc or sort of labor and extraction. Either either way, it's not for themselves, it's for us, kind of the other thing. And this gets to kind of the last part of the conversation, which is, well, what does this mean for broader stakes within Marxist discourse, Leninist discourse, and then anti-colonial struggle, and as you kind of are interested in, ultimately, something like a universality. but this is a particular form of universality that displaces Eurocentric kind of knowledge production. So I was wondering if we could say sort of the implications of this kind of perverse discourse and what do we do with it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we as I did, and I encourage obviously more scholars and readers to engage it and to talk about it. It's very important to mention it and to critique it, whether it's an eminent critique or a philosophical critique. Um, one of the things that I would frame it, the way that I would frame it would be like thinking about how he talks about the Al-Aqsa flood and in terms of um, discourses of counterterrorism and securitization, rather than, again, resituating Al-Aqsa flood within a historical materialist critique of or history of Palestinian anti-colonial resistance to Necro-Imperial domination. And stuff has been written about this. And again, he has done some work about it. Some people, many people endeared him around the world because of, you remember his song, cutting the balls off and whatever the fear that he had about violence. And I asked, if you don't have to agree with what Al-Aqsa flood did, right? But can you at least explain why the Aqsa flood or any other anti-colonial movement falls outside your own theories of violence and divine violence or radical universal emancipation? Like for me, it's a simple thing. And again, this is part of my own training and my understanding of his work. So I've been reading his work, and I think he offers very useful tools to understand the Palestinian resistance. So, for example, in one piece in 2018, I published on the March of Return, using the idea of divine violence that Walter Benjamin developed and Žižek used from him. If you don't agree with what they are doing, you have seen people like Norman Finkelstein, and Jody Dean and others invoke certain models of revolutionary anti-colonial resistance and activities to describe the what happened in the Al-Aqsa flood. Not to condone, you are describing, you're analyzing. He could have at least account for the way that this event fit into his own philosophy, his own political philosophy and theory of violence. At the least he could do. But again, like, he refuses to account for how Zionism, as that contradictory resolution of European anti-Semitism, displaces the cost of that resolution onto Palestinians. He cannot do that. He refuses to see Palestinian victimization in this. Really, it's like there's a blinder to his understanding of what's happening, and this is where I urge, our viewers and listeners to read the second part on the geographic displacement, because he doesn't see Gaza as the most important problem. He sees the West Bank as the most important problem, instead of linking them together. Right? It's not either or. They're both two sides of the same obscene necro-imperialist Zionist settler colonial project. So what he does, again, when it comes to Palestinian freedom, and by the way, my problem with him and his theories of violence and his inability to propose an explanation, theoretical explanation of what happened in the Al-Aqsa flood, is related to another project I'm working on, which is his theory of the Haitian Revolution and his interpretation of the Haitian Revolution. It's an issue that I have explored somewhere, but I'm becoming a little bit, I'm revisiting the issue, offering different interpretation of what he presents. And I think that would be also an important aspect of understanding what Finkelstein and Jody Dean and others talk about when they talk about Palestinian liberation. I'm not going to elaborate, just Maybe we can do another podcast in the future when the article is out or it's completed. But his inability to theorize the Palestinian as the constitutive exclusion of Zionism, that it is its negated term, emerges as the structural position that reveals the structural limit of Zionism's false universalism. And that, again, he stops there with Zionist anti-Semitism. For you to get to universality, you need to see the Palestinian as the determinate negation. So instead of confronting the contradiction between Zionism and anti-Semitism and the figure of the Palestinian, he privileges anti-Semitism as the main problem, and therefore, again, he forecloses any colonial reading of Palestine and neutralizes its revolutionary content. And for me, again, because I believe in international solidarity. I believe in internationalism as a way for us to seek solidarity with other oppressed groups. And again, I appropriated some of his terms, like concrete universality, to talk about Palestinians in the past. But then in this article, or as I show in his writing on Gaza, he turns he completely subverts his notion of concrete universality when he talks about anti-Semitism as a concrete universality, something that I really don't understand. How how can he not see how anti-Semitism has been weaponized to silence and exclude and persecute people in today's um, um, market and discourses and social media and everything else? But as I said, there's this notion of universal singular in his work that he sort of hides in a footnote in one of his books that I thought, in relation to the Palestinians, that he doesn't elaborate on. But I thought this is a good point, and I really like it. And I think that as the Palestinian condition can represent this form of radical universality that can not only reveal the truth of global injustice, can reveal the truth of the brutality of capitalism around the world through their constitutive exclusion, but can also show that as a people, Palestinians, whether they are colonized or refugees or disposable surplus population, they are being systematically and radically barred from full realization. And again, this is like one of his major ideas about universality. So because Palestinians are unable to become what they already are, they cannot fulfill or realize their full identities or subjectivities. They hold the potential, he says, to redefine and reconfigure universality itself by exposing its contingency and its completeness. So again, critiquing the Eurocentric colonialist forms of universality and opening a space or clearing a space for a new form of universality. But again, taking into consideration what he has been saying about Palestinians and about Gaza, it posed a dilemma for me. Like, can you really endorse this idea wholesale? And I decided that despite its promise that we would need to answer with a conditional affirmation that we should endorse this universal singular, but also if we connect it or re-anchor it in Frantz Fanon's work, especially the idea of the wretched of the earth and his idea of the zone of non-being, which basically connecting the Palestinians to all of those subjects, human beings around the world, who are put in a context of ontological deprivation, but who can transform their deprivation into revolutionary intervention through praxis. So the idea of collective struggle, the idea of organization becomes very important through Fanon. And you could see it like in some debates recently in 24 and 25 that I summarized briefly towards the end of the article, that when it comes to the Palestinian left and pro-Palestine activists to think about strategies for liberation that through organization, right, that we should organize through the contradictions of class and empire, as some of these colleagues state. So it means for me basically thinking about how the material mediation that joins analysis, subjectivity, and infrastructure together through in order to create a sense of universal struggle and universal solidarity, that it's not only about abstract identification with the oppressed, but thinking about it through structures of revolutionary organization that connect these struggles together, find forms of collective struggle that change these structures. So moving into the praxis, which obviously he doesn't talk about, right? It's in his idealist kind of register, the materiality of this organization, the materiality of collectivism um, completely disappears. And which is again, something that is strange for someone who wrote about Lenin and talked about Lenin and talked about the importance of such organization and the party and what have you for the utopian projects on the left.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think you really dug into most of my questions surrounding that, maybe even all of them. It seems like not only does he render it unthinkable in many different ways, right? So a lot of people discuss, Al-Aqsa as the impossible possible sort of thing, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, he only can render this sort of thing anti-Semitic, which doesn't remain legible, and again reconstitutes itself within forms of liberal Zionism that then equate it to sort of this symmetrical suffering instead of an asymmetrical colonial situation where one is dominated in many different ways, perhaps all ways, but there's moments of sort of non-foreclosure as we've seen perhaps and are even discussing. Um, I thought it was kind of insightful in your piece where you in the geographic rendering you kind of touch on how this not only sort of deviates and further mystifies where the site of genocidal violence is taking place, and it's also taking place within the West Bank, but also it further naturalizes these forms of fragmentation that have happened within the Palestinian polity and body. So by talking about these various locations, rather than just a separate, this is all sort of historic Palestine, he further creates another violence that's happening on the geographic body, as well as the individual body, and the social polity as well. So I think that just about answered everything quite well. Of course, we could get into more of the Lenin stuff and all this, but perhaps that would take us afield from the kind of
Yeah,
article itself.
we'll leave
But
that for another time.
of course, and I think what comes to mind is why doesn't he talk about Palestinian organizations that were Lenin?
Yeah. Again, some of the things I know from my previous correspondence with him. Obviously, he engages with conversations and debates with many people from different parts of the world. And obviously, he is an avid reader and he educates himself about these things. But also, he relies, I think, on his native informants, so to speak, to give him some sort of insight of what's going on. Um, I'm not really sure, why he wouldn't talk about something, but that can tell you about where his heart is really. I mean, if he was really interested in uncovering the Leninist, Maoist, whatever identification he is interested in the Palestinian struggle, he could have found it. I mean, there's the work of Ghassan Kanafani, many George Habash, many people from the PFLP and others who are Marxist and Leninist, and it's not difficult but again, is that really what he wants to see Palestinians, associated with, or how does that undermine the kind of argument that he has about this moral equivalence that he's talking about in through his analysis? So again, I don't speculate about intention. I don't know what he's thinking or his, again, as I said before, libidinal investment. But what we can see is really disturbing. So instead of, for example, and Welcome to the Desert of the Real, talking exactly about that genealogy of Marxist leftist Palestinian factions, he decides to talk about anti-Semitism as the problem. And without citing anything, without quoting anyone, just, oh, these Palestinians are anti-Semites and or the Arab anti-Semitism. Like, where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? Where do you get that from? Based on who? And again, that tells you for sure about some of his problematic position that got him into these hot waters with the uncontested debates with various leftist intellectuals, and now with the interested or the new iteration of the interest in Western Marxism that we see with the publication of Lusurdo's book. And this is coming back again to raise many questions about his political legacy.
Yeah, for sure. And also just not looking at particular organizations and overemphasizing others. He sort of like makes everything just also about different aspects of religion. And this is like an ongoing battle of religion or something rather than looking at different formations, right? And there's various aspects of being Palestinian, right? Not everyone is the same religion, has the same ideologies, right? He doesn't even get to the possibilities of like a Christian Palestinian, right? Or even a Jewish Palestinian, or what these various things mean and look like. He just conflates it all with one particular form of
Yeah.
Islam, which kind of reproduces this like terroristic kind of discourse that he seems to.
Okay, well, Lee, I think, just for the sake of objectivity, I mean, I think that his position on Islam is a little bit more complex. Like, if you read my article on Hegel and Zizek's interpretation of the archives of Islam, I talk a little bit about that. So he has some sort of understanding of the transformative political value of political Islam. So he's not really. He talks about terrorists and Islamic terrorists, but and he talks about Islamic fundamentalists, but he has some hopes actually for political Islam, which was common among some French intellectuals, European intellectuals in the 1990s. So he gets it, I think, from there. But it's worth, a little bit dissecting and differentiating his position on it. Just because I think that he makes a more subtle, deeper argument about the nature of political Islam. Again, I wrote about it in my Hegel article because the second section or third section of that article was basically talking about Zizek's understanding of political Islam and its value and its potential, which he found to be radical. Ironically enough, like for many Muslim secularists, they don't, they disagree, but he was arguing for it.
That's great. Thank you for the clarification. We'll have to put that in the show notes as well. That sounds wonderful. Um, I know he also does stuff talking about Buddhism and Tibet
Yeah.
and these various situations that you've also spoken about. But so I guess our time is about to end. I'm just wondering if there's anything else you want to say that we haven't touched on, things you're working
Ah,
on. I know you mentioned some things, et cetera, et cetera.
yeah. Well, I'm currently finalizing a couple of articles. Like I mentioned, Adaniya Shibli's Minor Detail, Tafsil Thanawi. I encourage everyone to read it. Very interesting book. One of my articles is coming out soon on it in a journal, and then a longer piece is coming out. Hopefully, it will be accepted for publication in a different journal. But it's a novel that's related to some of the issues that we talk about here, and I applied some of the my critique of the Zionism's false universality to the novel itself, and Adania Shibli really shows that there really well. in what is called, Zionist socialist or socialist Zionist factions, which is an oxymoron for me. But again, um, I would say in the end, as you said, we should continue thinking about Žižek and other Western philosophers, trying to expose the limits of these theories from the position of this genocide in Gaza. As many people have been saying, Gaza has become a blueprint for the future. The emphasis on the material structures of necro-imperial colonization are very important, and understanding how people are resisting these structures all over the world, in the United States and everywhere else. So we need to think about that gap between philosophy's desire for totality and the world's unassimilable antagonisms, in order to show that universality must be organized through the concrete contradictions of empire, labor, and colonization. One last thing is that, to think from Palestine is, for me, not to provincialize theory, but to universalize it differently, to reconstruct universality from the standpoint of the excluded, those rendered killable and disposable by necro-imperial colonialism. This is what really where my heart is and my commitment is to justice to those disposable surplus populations that are rendered killable without any accountability everywhere in the world.
Wonderfully said. Thank you.
So instead of saying, workers of the world unite, I would say disposable surplus population of the world unite. Really, that's my motto.
Yes, beautifully said, and a lot of great work being done on that sort of thing with Ali Khadri. Ali Khadri comes to mind, the accumulation of
Yeah,
waste and all
absolutely.
these things. Also, beautiful book as well, Minor Detail. I read it. I was quite moved by it. I thought the structure of it was phenomenal as well. Um,
I'm not going to reveal my interpretation of the structure, but later on we can see how you thought about the way that she links them together.
well,
I
excellent. I'm
came up
looking
with a new
forward.
interpretation, so we'll see how that goes.
Excellent, excellent. I'm looking forward to having my mind blown from that piece. So thank you so much. Thanks for taking the time
Thank you, Lee.
to speak.
Appreciate it. Much appreciated. Thanks a lot. Have a good day.
You too. Have a
Bye
good
bye.
one.